Hello and welcome to Economy Matters, a first post live series on key issues confronting the economy. Today we will be discussing the crisis facing Indian farmers with Dr. Abhijit Sen, who's former member Planning Commission. He was former member Agriculture in the Planning Commission, and he was also former chairman of the Commission on Agricultural Costs and Prices, as well as Mr. T. Nandakumar, who was former Secretary Agriculture and former chairman of the National Dairy Development Board. Welcome to Economy Matters, sir. Dr. Sen, I'll start with you. The farmers' march in Maharashtra ended with assurances being given by the state government. One, of course, related to implementation of the Forest Rights Act, which is sort of specific to the state. But there were two key assurances on higher minimum support prices and debt loan waivers. Now, it is true that pricing and indebtedness are two key issues facing farmers. But do these kind of solutions, are they more a knee-jerk reaction? Do they even begin to address the structural problems facing the sector?
Well, I think the price issue is a real continuous issue. And it gets exacerbated when world prices are low. It gets exacerbated when domestic demand for some reason is lower. But this is a continuous issue, just as productivity is. These two make up farm incomes. The debt issue is a different kind. It acquires significance only if the general trend of farm incomes has been so bad that over a few years it has come to a situation where a number of people are unable to pay debt. So debt cannot be seen as a continuing problem. It is rather the accumulation of other problems, and solving that will not solve the underlying problem. So that's it's a nature of a knee-jerk, that when do you get into that act. Now sometimes it's necessary. Banks all over the world at all times have to take a decision on taking a haircut themselves simply to keep investment going. And this is that sort of thing. The only problem is that for other types of enterprises, you rely on two things. One, if you don't give a haircut, there is an exit. The firm just goes out and some new firm comes into being. With 50% of your population in agriculture, saying that people will keep going out is a bit much. So all that they have to do is to just bear the pain. The second is that normally one-time settlements of any kind require going case by case into the merits of a case. Again, because the numbers are so high, this is something which is hardly ever done. I think the only state which tried doing it is Kerala for some time by setting up a commission on this thing. But, so I said, I think the loan waiver is a different order of things. It's not a solution to the problem. But farm prices is something to which we need a solution. MSP is the existing big one. That's probably not the only solution. Is certainly not the best solution. Therefore, I would put the two things somewhat different. But in this present case, the Forest Rights Act was equally major, if not an even more major issue. So I don't think we should read too much on the general problem from the problem of the tribals, which is grave and which is extremely important.
Now, the Forest Rights Act, it's not just a problem. I mean, it's sort of peculiar to Maharashtra also, but it's also going to be an issue in other states as well. Implementation of the Forest Rights Act in terms of giving land titles to tribals and all that has been very tardy in most states. Do you think serious action needs to be done on this front?
Well, there are really two things happening here. One, Adivasis generally tend to fall out of the radar of politicians, except some. Second, when governments hear about things like Forest Rights Act, they hear it from the Forest Department. And the Forest Department, in its day-to-day dealings, sees forest dwellers as a problem rather than something for them to think anything about. So they see it as encroachment, and it's again, just as people would say there are, moral hazards to debt, similarly they would say moral hazards to forest rights.
I'm going to come back to you on the pricing front, but before that, Mr. Nandakumar, do you feel that the solution in Maharashtra was it in a sense did it sort of ignore long-term issues for short-run crisis management?
Yeah, it does. Now coming to the Forest Rights Act itself, it looks like Maharashtra, the implementation have been somewhat skewed. I think 2 districts had probably much larger number of cases than other districts. There are other states which have probably done a slightly better job. But as Professor Sen rightly says, tribals have generally lived in forests and they have protected the forest more than the forest department. Somehow forest department sees them as inimical to environment and forest, which is a bad idea. So I think we need to push that. It's a simple implementation issue. There is no policy issue here. The policies are well laid out. I think they just need to push that implementation. That will take away one set of problems, howsoever minor it may be, but very major from a tribal's sustainable living point of view. On the loan waiver, yes, there are some arguments for it, there are some arguments against it, but rightly one loan waiver is not going to take you anywhere. We did that in 2009 nationally. You are again up with a demand in many states in the last 2-3 years. The major question is, after loan waiver, what?
Yeah.
How do you address the issues of agriculture in many of these? And Maharashtra typically has problems of lack of adequate water, less irrigation, and also whatever little irrigation is available being diverted to sugarcane. So
yes,
there is a set of problems in Maharashtra. Dairying, which does very well in Gujarat, has not done that well in Maharashtra because they have, the cooperative unions are not integrated in the Amul model. So they have so many of them and they are fighting with each other for the space. So even that has not really taken off. So I think Maharashtra needs to look at agriculture from a point of view of markets and the natural resources they have, and they probably need to redraw the map.
Dr. Sen, coming back to the pricing issue, since that is really the key to a lot of other problems. Now, on the budget promise of 50% of MSP, most criticism has revolved around 50% of what, and it's a point you have also been making. But in one of your interviews, you made another point about whether the government should have been declaring that assuring that 50% of MSP at all, and you're saying that it sort of is giving a signal to the CACP, which is really an expert body. But then the Swaminathan committee had suggested assuring 50% of MSP. So how do you reconcile all these issues?
See, I think this is a complicated issue, and the reason it is complicated is for a very simple reason. Costs vary from not just region to region, but from farmer to farmer within a region. So any cost, however defined, there will be at least 50% whose costs are higher than that, and at least 50% whose costs are lower than that. The guy whose costs are high will shout. Okay, so making it entirely cost-based raises the issue of whose cost, and people will be able to find, averages conceal a lot of variation.
But how does the CACP address this?
They take an average, they take an all-India average, but that won't solve the problems of, say, Maharashtra, which is a high-cost state. So basically, you'll have to go out from something which sort of ties it only down to cost. It has to also do with not just other issues, but a sense of fairness, which can come with the CSCP or any other organization discussing this matter, not just with experts, but also with stakeholders. I think it's done not always very well, not always very badly, but as an institution, the CSCP is still something which nobody slams as much as they slam a number of other agencies. Of course they are slammed. I think really to say that you have to do it 50% plus might be a difficult thing to put such an institution into. I think institutions need to be respected. I think it would have been enough to say that the CSCP should take into consideration the recommendations of the Swaminathan Committee. I think that should have been enough. Because, frankly, I don't think C2 plus 50% is on. I think A2 plus FL plus 50% is possible. On an average, during the UPA years, in fact, it was 50% around. I mean, not every year, not for every crop.
50% over C2?
Over A2 plus FL.
A2 plus.
It has not been the case for some time now. And one of the reasons for that is what the world price situation is. But I think the flexibility on this issue is important. But as I said, we can get too much into the details of MSP policy. I think to some extent say that, there's a commission we appointed or the previous government appointed, or in fact it was the previous NDA government which appointed. They came out with a thing. CSCP should take that into consideration. And CSCP will. I think it has been doing to some extent. And then think of, okay, we've got MSP system, but MSP covers only 20 crops, that also in certain regions. What the hell are we going to do about A, making implementation better, irrespective of what the MSP is, and second, stretching out to all the perishable crops which simply do not and cannot have an MSP.
The budget had this time spoken about, linking farmers directly to the rural hearts, sort of upgrading the rural hearts, and, in order to get, recognizing that, a lot of the farmers do not get the MSP that has been declared. Has that been sufficient? Do you feel that is adequate attention has been given to that?
See, look here, I think there is nothing new about saying we'll link it to this thing and that. I think all governments keep saying something of a similar kind. And I think there are other things which also help to bring farmers closer to markets. To take a simple thing, building roads does.
Yes.
I mean, I think the Gram Sadak Yojanas have done quite a bit to get the individual farmer who's far away to get a better price. But having said all that, we haven't actually been able to come anywhere near resolving the problem. So there are different approaches to it, including, for example, this whole matter of ENAM and things, getting technology, getting infrastructure, and getting... But finally, I think whatever you do, you need investment. And you need that investment, especially in the case of perishables, in rather expensive investment, not just cheap investment. And I think there are two questions there. Who does the investing? I think governments have always found that if we start investing, it will be a large investment. We'll try to find out policies by which the private sector comes in. A lot has been done in those. For example, the entire reform of agricultural markets, the entire issue of, for an investment in retailing, were around these issues. We've been doing it now for 15 years, and we know that, yes, you get a little bit, but you simply don't get enough. So I think this is an area in which we've got to actually say we've tried to think of a lot of things over these few years. Should we again begin to start thinking about these matters?
Mr. Kumar, on this issue of, the issue raised about farmers not getting MSP and, the other alternatives to it. The point about the ENAM and APMC is, ENAM really is setting up the technology, but it is hampered by a lot of regulatory cholesterol. So, and states not allowing, amending their APMC acts, and there's still a lot of legal hurdles to trading even within the state, across mandis, forget about across states. So do issues like ENAM then, will ENAM just become an empty technological shell without these regulatory hurdles being removed? And also on the private sector, why can't we think of somehow, and if these regulatory challenges are addressed, the private sector will probably come in a greater way to set up those storage and warehousing and other facilities. Do you think that's a way to go about it?
Well, one is if you look at the entire marketing infrastructure, you're right in saying that there have been a lot of barriers to interstate trade, even inter-APMC trade.
Yes.
I think Azadpur Mandi is a classic example of how trade should not be done. They talk about transparency, it's not there. We need to break some of those. Apart from that, I think the major problem that we have in trading across platforms is we haven't got the specifications right, we haven't got the standards right, and we don't have the financial architecture to ensure that the payments take place on time. And also there are no aggregators. Now, obviously, small farmers can come in only if there are good aggregators. Aggregators can be farmer producer companies, aggregators can be private people. So, wherever there is aggregation, you will find even the MSP procurement is better. Why is it that Punjab is able to procure more compared to Bihar in terms of rice? Is also because of the infrastructure, godowns, the aggregators, the systems in place. So, I think ENAM is a good beginning, but there's a lot more to be added on, not only in terms of regulatory bottlenecks being removed, which is essential to start, but I think we need to look at aggregation, we need to look at delivery options, we need to probably have a dispute resolution mechanism, because a person sitting, let's say, in Tamil Nadu is buying potatoes from Agra. Based on an electronic transfer, when the potatoes reach Tamil Nadu, he needs to be sure that what he has bought is what he has got. So, this is where I think we need to bring in a lot more of deliverable transparency in the whole system, without which I doubt very much. Maybe it's easier to start with the cereals and pulses and stuff like that, which is not perishable. Perishables will be a still more difficult game.
Since you mentioned perishables, and a point which Dr. Sen was also talking about, about the MSP not covering perishables and all that. The Operation Greens, which was announced in the budget, was about replicating the Amul model in tomato, onion and potato. Now, you've been with NDTB and you've obviously seen as Secretary Agriculture and as how the model works. There is a view that you can't really replicate a model which was meant for milk to perishables. Do you agree with that? And what else needs to be done to make this work?
Well, this is a different ball game. Let's accept that if you're just taking 3 vegetables, which is what I think we're talking about, is potatoes, onions and tomatoes. Primarily because I think there's a lot of consumer resistance to higher prices. I think that's where it actually comes from.
In fact, if I would like you to address that also, whether this is a good way to address, the balance, constant tussle which governments are forced to between urban consumers and farmers. Does this help balance that?
No, I think the first thing we need to understand is how much of our policies are consumer centric and how much of our policies are actually towards farmers. I think at the first sight of inflation, we tend to side with the consumer.
Exactly.
And then the farmer pays the price. So let's look at these 3 crops in terms of Operation Greens. It's not the same as Operation Flood. It cannot be done in a day. And I would even personally think that probably the government grant is not a good idea, because Operation Flood was without too much government money, even though it was a monetization of commodities. You need an autonomous organization which has the freedom to look at farmers' prices and then put it into the market. You can have systems in which you can release a certain percentage of the stock every month so that you keep the prices in control, but not in terms of a government control of stock regulation, etc. The second is that the volumes that you're talking about in these 3 are very large.
Yes.
It's anything above 20 million tons of each crop, potato maybe more. How much can you actually take it to a process situation? It's probably very small. So essentially you're talking about moving fresh and frozen into the marketing areas. I think we have to start small. We have to start with probably 5 or 7 metros. Look at about 100-kilometer radius where you can capture this and see what kind of technologies are required for building this cold chain and into the market. Now let's also remember that most of retail is not through a cold chain.
Yes.
So you can't really put it in a cold storage, take it out and put it in the open sun. The thermal shock will be good enough to kill the whole vegetable. So how do we combine traditional technologies and traditional transport models to bring in a retail and connect to the producer? It can be done. I am surely of the view that it can be done. We have to start small. We have to be very specific on what we do. I think the most important part of all this is if you are able to assure that 70% of the consumer rupee goes to the farmer. I think this argument between the urban consumer and the farmer could be reduced to a significant extent.
And if Operation Greens is done well, this 70% of consumer rupee going to the farmer will result?
I've done some examples with Safal. We have been able to reach up to 65%. So I believe 70 is easy if you have a much larger market.
Right. Dr. Sen, about MSP, and you also spoken earlier about alternatives. Now, this price deficiency payments system, which this government has again talked about as an alternative. Now, given the limited results we have from Madhya Pradesh and to a lesser extent Haryana, do you think this is a good way of going about it? Will this be a good alternative to MSP?
In theory. In practice, there are glitches in everything, including this one. There have been instances where people have told me that people are gaming this system as much as they game any others, and that the possibilities of gaming the system are huge in this one. Now, I think there are two things that Nandakumar actually mentioned which are as necessary to MSP operations as they are to non-MSP operations. And that is specifications which are clear, which they are in the case of procurement of rice and wheat for the FCI, and that there is adequate grading. Because if you're going to actually do MSP operations through the market rather than through a particular government buyer, the probability of quality will remain. At the moment, yes, FCI people often cheat farmers, undergrade them. But let's also not face it that FCI also gets cheated. I mean, they also are given very poor quality stuff. And this will happen even more when it comes to private trade accepting it, if the grading and the specification is not clearly done. And you can have all sorts of bills being given for purchase, which may be more than what was worth in terms of what was bought. So, as I said, it's something which can be done, worth trying it. 2 states are trying it. I would say this should be left to the state governments rather than the central government stepping in. Most states today in MSP operations, at least for rice and wheat, are on, it's a decentralized procurement process. So the responsibility is that of the states. There is a money transaction to some extent which the central government comes into, but I think that's all that it should be. This should be on the decentralized side, I think. I think trying to rush into it with, central, pilots would, I think, A, overburden the existing system, and B, lead to less experimentation than I think one needs to. I think there has to be an oversight, but as I said, our real problem with marketing is in specifications, grading, and a sense of I know when I'm paying what I'm paying that money for. And it's not for, something which is weirdly different from what I thought I was paying for.
One major issue facing the farmers is about crop failures, and that is in a way related to their, falling into debt traps and not being able to repay their loans. The Pradhan Mantri Fasal Bima Yojana had, addressed a lot of the lacunae of earlier crop insurance schemes, but even this has not worked too well. Why is that?
See, actually the Fasal Bima Yojana is an expanded version of what we've had earlier. It's expanded in the sense that the premiums are lower, and it's expanded in the sense that more crop cutting experiments are being conducted. But having said that, it's roughly the same whole thing that you've got. And it's obviously had problems of rolling out. I mean, the rollout has been less satisfactory than. But again, I think there are matters. The insurance matter is something that a lot of people have been going into. You see, most of these things are things that I think the system has been trying to understand for well before he was Secretary of Agriculture. I mean, it's
going on for
decades, okay?
Yes.
And a lot of people have been. For example, insurance. The last report on this was written by a gentleman who is now in the PMO, supposed to be one of the most important officials in the PMO. And he wrote it just before the last election, that's the 2014 election. And he's a guy who did his PhD on agricultural insurance. So I'm sure it's got the focus of people who have years of understanding and also are in places where things can be, controlled from. And yet if we say that things are not going as they should, it tells me simply that the problem is really quite complicated. And I think one of the reasons for this is that when it comes to crop failures, we have got confused between two or three very different approaches to it, and we try to lump it sometimes, segregate them sometimes. We have disaster management. We have, crop insurance, which is on the basis of yields, for which you need to know the yield. And you've got weather insurance, which is something which is not based on the yields, is based on the weather parameters, but then you try to link it back with the yields in some sense. You've got audit saying that you can't do all three together, when sometimes the best thing might be that you go on met data, do weather, but do it as a first step for the first payment, and then move back to something more conventional if you want to. But you've got to combine these things, because clearly the problem is not a simplistic problem. And it's not going to be solved by having a huge number of crop cutting experiments. It's simply going to reduce the efficiency of those experiments. So I think we are not quite grasping the enormity of what we set out to do. The enormity is large. We must think of flexibility within it and combining some of these things together.
There have been two new initiatives by some states again relating to cash payments to farmers. So one, there's a central government pilots on fertilizer subsidy being paid as DBT, and I think Andhra Pradesh and Karnataka are toying with the idea of giving a lump sum to farmers, which is a kind of they call it a basic income. Do you think these cash transfers to farmers will work better than the input subsidies and the other kind of subsidies which they were getting?
You see, call cash transfers cash transfers.
Okay.
I think that's the only way to do it, okay? Essentially, they would play roughly the same sort of role as a debt waiver. What it's essentially doing is you've got into a situation where you think that a money should be given to the farmer, either because costs are high, prices are low, you think you've got to cover it, so you want to pay some money to the farmer. But you don't want to be in a situation where you're micromanaging. So let the farmer choose what they're doing. But let's also not forget that in doing so, you're essentially saying that I consider a situation where farmers deserve money and I'm giving it to them. And I'm not doing it for any particular purpose. Now that's a real audit shift, because audit is immediately going to ask, how is it different from simply a bloody handout? Secondly, who is a farmer, who is not? How much are you giving a farmer? Is it for is that cost? Is he growing the crops for which you have calculated the costs? You can have n number of audit questions of that kind. So I think it's better to call it that you are actually giving a certain amount of money to farmers who are not in a position to cover their costs with the prices obtained, and that's what the purpose of this is. And the farmer himself knows how to best to cope with it.
What about fertilizer DBT? Is that a better idea?
See, the fertilizer DBT, I don't know exactly how it's working on the ground. I mean, I get very mixed things. From the government side, it's working fine. From a lot of farmers' side, it isn't working all that well. I think essentially what the original idea was that we moved towards a nutrition-based pricing, which didn't happen because we kept urea out of it. And the second thing was that once you move to a nutrition-based pricing, you try to take off the subsidy from the firms producing the fertilizer and transfer it to the retail point. Now the retail point, it could have been transferred either to the farmer or to the retailer. And you had a POS, a point of sale assessment, what has been sold, on the basis of which you transfer the subsidy. It could be done to either of the two. There were again committees after committee, one of them headed by Nilekani and things, who had suggested do it to the retailer. Now what is moving out on the ground is a bit hydra-faced. Okay. And I think we are again in a situation where it's something which is still happening. So I think it's too early to say anything definitive about it.
Mr. Anantkumar, final question to you. I mean, like Dr. Sen has been saying that, on agriculture and all the issues facing agriculture, there have been committee reports after committee reports. There's a whole laundry list of what needs to be done, which has been going on since, I think, the early 90s. But nothing ever happens. Now, you've been in the ministry as secretary. What really stops success? And this is not a problem limited to this government. This is a problem facing successive governments. What ultimately stops governments from taking that one or two steps to alleviate the condition of the farmers?
One is, I think...
is it politics? Is it the bureaucracy itself which is a hurdle?
Well, I would say both. But I think more importantly, have we looked at institutions which are supposed to deliver?
Okay.
I don't think we have. Whether it's technology, whether it's market, whether it's insurance, whether it's delivery of inputs, whichever way you look at it, I think we have not looked at the institutions which need to deliver, and then you can clearly see a delivery deficit in all these areas that you are talking about. That's number one. Second, I think we have not provided space for innovation. We have written so many committee reports, and therefore everybody is able to do a little bit of cherry picking on all sides, sometimes for political convenience, sometimes for bureaucratic convenience, and then I don't think we have really looked at what needs to be done as a whole. Now look at something like doubling farmers' income. I think we are still writing reports after reports after reports. We could have started with probably 1 or 2 or 3 ideas and rolled it out. By the time 2 years are over, we could have learned something from some of those things. And I think most importantly, we have to admit that in the policy space, the farmer has to come out a couple of notches higher, at least equal to the consumer, if not above him. I think our policies are somewhat consumer centric, which affects farmers. And lastly, I think the state governments have to be a very major part of what we try to do. In fact, RKVY was the first step where we thought we had got the state governments on board. It's got diluted again. I think we have to go back to a situation where we say, okay, this is what the states will achieve, whatever is what you are saying, doubling farmers' income or increasing agriculture productivity, whichever way you want to define the parameters, and say here is X amount of money, you do insurance, you do soil testing, you do market reforms, you do everything, but we want that result at the end of the day. I think we have to be very clear and unambiguous on what we do, and I don't think we should prescribe sitting in Krishi Bhavan.
Or we shouldn't also, politicians shouldn't also be using farmers just to create an emotional kind of this thing, or basically making them political pawns, really.
Well, I'm not sure. It happens, like when there is a march or when there is some distress, you talk about farmers, but the moment onion prices shoot up in Delhi above 35 rupees, I'm sure that everybody shifts to the consumer. And then I think Safal will be asked to sell onions at 20 rupees or something. So I don't think we can have that kind of wavering. As long as the farmer is getting about 65 to 70% of the consumer rupee, we should be happy with whatever prices are obtained.
Right. On that note, we hope state governments and the central government is listening to all this. Thank you very much.